Hi everybody, welcome to another video. And today's video we're talking about procedural materials and textures. One and the same. So if I say materials, I mean textures and vice versa. And today we'll be looking at what we mean by procedural materials, why we use them, pros and cons, and we'll see some of the practices and processes of creating procedural materials in Blender. So we'll do that in this video as well. And finally, we'll have a look at a couple of resources of where you can get procedural materials to use in your own projects. So let's crack on. Okay, let's start by actually figuring out what procedural materials actually mean. In a nutshell, it means that procedural materials are a powerful way of creating very realistic, right through to cartoon style materials or textures. Unlike image-based textures, they are mathematically calculated and are derived from algorithms, parameters, and inputs and outputs. Put simply, procedural textures are created in software and are calculated on the fly. I'm reading my notes, by the way. And as such, the possibilities are pretty much endless, really, or limitless, I should say. So really, how does that compare with image textures, which you're probably very familiar with? So let's have a quick look at some image textures. And one of those places where you can get these images from is a website such as ambientcg.com. I use this quite frequently. And let's say you can head over to this website, click on materials, search for something, perhaps, brick, wood, metal, whatever, and find your material and download it. So here's an example, ground 068. And you'll notice on the right-hand side in the top right there, we have various links to zip files, JPEG, PNG, and so on. So jumping ahead, download the zip file if that's what you want to use. And I'll just show you what we get once we do that. There it is. So we've got the zip file we downloaded. And if we extract the files from that, this is what we get. And we have ambient occlusion, color, displacement, normal maps, roughness, and some of the files I don't really use. Quick note about the normal maps. You notice there's two of them. You don't use both, of course. You only use one. And you'll notice, or not, it may be a bit small on YouTube. One is appended with the letters DX, and the other one GL. Now, DX means DirectX, and other one GL means OpenGL. Now, Blender is an open source software, of course, and it supports or prefers the OpenGL normal map format. So make sure you use this one, not the DirectX one. Right, skipping back to procedures. This is what you get with image textures. So unlike procedural, they're fixed files. They're based on perhaps photographs and things like that, or someone's created them in an image editing software like Photoshop or Affinity Photo. You get the drill. So procedural maps are very, very different. And there are various reasons why you want to use them over an image-based material, such as the one we just saw from Ambient CG. One of those reasons why is limitless possibilities. You can combine the inputs and the outputs to create any number of unique materials, all mathematically, if I can say that, calculated. They're also more memory and performance efficient than image-based textures, which is always a good thing. They offer a greater degree of control and flexibility over how materials and styles look. And you can combine and layer them. There's really no limit to procedural textures. And, excuse me, by making adjustments to parameters and inputs, you can easily create variations and different styles. And this is great when you want say you have a kind of specific scene that you're working on and you want the material to look right within that scene. Well, it's much easier to tweak the material if it's procedural to get it to look the way you want it to look for that particular scene. A little bit harder with the image textures. It's not impossible, but just might take a little bit more work. So there is that. Okay, let's talk about disadvantages, because that all sounds fantastic, right? But what's the catch? Well, I guess they can look fairly artificial at times, but that really depends on you and how you create your procedural material. Perfectly clean materials aren't very realistic. So if you're after realism, you can either create more complex procedural materials or revert back to using image-based texture maps, as the one we just saw from Ambient CG. Another disadvantage, compared to image-based textures, that is, the image ones are based on real photographs. And because for that reason, they would have captured the nuances and finer details and variations found in real world materials. Yes, you can replicate that in procedural materials, but again, you have to then think about the nodes you need to use, where to plug them in, perhaps combine them with other nodes to create the final material that you want. I found this quite often as well when I'm watching videos online, and you know, these talented YouTube Blender creators, and they're creating these wonderful materials. Now they can be complex, let's put it that way. So depends on what you're after, of course. Because they're limitless in their nature, all the nodes that you need, you can plug in, you know, can be run into the dozens or even 100 nodes or 200, whatever. They can become quite large quite quickly and quite complex. So it can be a little bit intimidating for newbies to procedural materials and can be off-putting, but not to worry. You don't have to throw dozens of nodes at a material to get it to look the way you want it to look. Another disadvantage compared to image-based textures is image-based textures are pretty much easier to create and edit with software such as Photoshop, Affinity Photo, and other software, of course. And as you've just seen as well, they're easier to find online for practically any material you can think of. Another disadvantage is to procedural materials, that is, they only work or tend to work well, very well, in the software that you create them. So what does that mean? So we're using Blender, right? So if you create a procedural material in Blender, you can't really expect to take that object with its procedural shader attached to it, assigned to it, into Cinema 4D or Maya or other software and expect it to look or even work at all. So there is that. It's very specific and unique to that software where you created it. Okay, with all that said, let's jump into Blender and actually have a look around. Where do we look for these materials? Where do we make them? How do we make them? What does it look like? What does the process look like? Well, as you can see behind me there, I've got Blender open, and this is an old file now for me. It's the asteroid one. You can see in the top right there. Here, you can see the asteroid that I made. So that's a fairly complex material in itself. And I've also thrown in a cube here, the default cube. So when you fire up Blender, you're normally thrown into the layout workspace. So that's the top left tab running along the top there in Blender. And you can see you've got all of these tabs here. So you've got layout, modeling, and so on and so on. When you're working on shading, yes, you can do it here as well. It's not to say you have to go somewhere else, but it's kind of easier just to click on the shading tab. And that already has the viewports ready and made for you to work with shading and materials. In contrast, if I go back to layout, yes, I could do materials here, but I'd have to either split the window like this and switch one of these to the shader editor and maybe collapse this window with N and so on and so forth. But that can get messy quite quickly, so I don't tend to do that too often. I usually click on shading and I have my shading workspace there. So first question is, where do I find it? Right there in the shading tab. Okay. How does it work? Well, this is what you see with any standard default material in Blender. Don't be scared of what you see here. And I don't mean that in the worst way possible. I mean, it just sounds a bit weird saying that, but don't be put off by, oh my God, there's this huge node there and it's got all these inputs and it's like, what do they all mean? Well, luckily, you don't really need to use a lot of them, just a few. In fact, you can use none of them, actually. You don't have to plug anything into these to get a nice material. So I'll give you an example of that. So if I switch this viewport at the top into rendered mode, You can see there we have the asteroid model from the previous exercise video that I made. And this one is the default cube. And when you start a new file, you probably have either no material applied to this at all, or you have a basic material such as this one applied to new shapes. And incidentally, on the right hand side, just below the outliner, which is this part here in the top, you've got the properties panel here. And you notice these little icons here. They're all great and they all have their purpose. But the one we're interested in is the one second from the bottom, and it's labeled material. So if we click that, I'll just make this a little bit bigger. This material is this one here. Okay, it's exactly the same thing. So you can see here we've got white, 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 white. So if I was to change something on this side, make that blue, it makes it blue in the window on this side. And of course our cube updates to blue. So it works both ways, of course. If I change the color here to yellow, it changes it there. So that's the same material. Quick note, the name of the material is here, and also here, and here. And you can change it in any of three of these places. So you can either change it here, here, or double click it there, and just type in whatever you like, and press enter or click away. You can see that's now changed the material name. Okay, nothing too difficult so far, quite easy. You've already got a basic material on this cube, and let me just quickly add a UV sphere to demonstrate. So I press G and then Y to move that over here, right click to smooth. Now we have this sphere, and as you can see, it doesn't have a material. It has nothing applied to it. So you may have this in your new file or a model you've added into Blender, and you simply click new, and we'll give this material a name. Let's call it sphere. And again, we've got this very basic principled BSDF material, which is the default for all materials in Blender, pretty much. As I said earlier, you can now go and change these colors and make them whatever you like. Excuse me. Let's change this one to, I don't know, a blue sphere or something. Now that's lovely. And all we've done there is change the base color. Now, if you want to create a basic material, you don't need to plug anything into this. You can simply change the color, the metallic value, the roughness, and that's pretty much it. That's the most simplistic material you can get. So let's say, for example, I wanted to make this ball a little bit more shiny than it currently is. I'll just bring that into focus with the dot key on the numpad. So let's make that a little bit more shiny. So how do we do that with this material here? And that is down to several things, but mainly the roughness value. And the default is 0.5, bang in the middle. So if we drag this all the way to the left, we now have a very smooth finish on the surface of this ball, and it becomes very shiny. So you can see there you've got some reflections of the environment happening there. And if I slide this all the way to 1, it becomes very rough, the surface of the material. And now we don't really get much highlights or specular lighting, which is also called a highlight, on the object. So roughness is a good one to play around with. 0.5 is fine, depending on what you're going for. But lower numbers give you a much nicer kind of look and feel to the object. The other ones here, you don't really play around with too much unless you know or you need those values to be changed. I won't go through them today because this is pretty much an introduction to procedural materials. But you've got things like emission, alpha values, transmission, clear coats, and other things that are a little bit more advanced, but not too difficult to get your head around once you start playing with them. Okay, let's create a basic material. Okay, so I've gone ahead and deleted the cube, don't really need that, and I've kept the UV sphere, and we use that as our example and create a very basic material. which we've done already actually. We've, just by clicking new, we've created a very basic material. So you could just change the color, change the roughness value, and I forgot to mention earlier, the metallic value is really good as well. Very useful. So in the real world, there's two types of material effectively, metallic and non-metallic. I forget, it's called dielectric, I think it's called. So if it's made of metal or has a metal component to it, you should really slide this metallic slider all the way to 1, right? And if it isn't made of metal or has a metal composition, leave it at 0. That's it. I know it's a slider, so you might be tempted to say, okay, well, I might leave it at 0.2 or halfway. You can do that if you want more kind of non-realistic or stylized materials, but in reality, it should either be 1 or 0, okay? Right, with that said, I will make this 1 because I think it looks a lot more interesting once we have this kind of metallic component going on, which is really nice. And the roughness plays really well with the metallic value, really. So if I bring that right up, of course, we lose all, you know, kind of shine and depth to that. But if I bring it down, you get this fantastic look, high contrast, lovely highlights. I mean, we've already got a really nice looking material just as it is there. And all we've done is change the color, the metallic value, and the roughness value. So that is really as simple as it gets. What if we want to do something a bit more complex? Well, that's quite easy as well. And you only need to plug in a couple of bits and pieces here to get a much more exciting and complex material going procedurally. So let's have a quick look at doing that. So I'm focusing on the roughness here because that has the biggest impact, as well as the color. And I'll show you that in a second. Let's start with the roughness. It tends to be the most common thing to change in most materials early on. And we're going to stick to a procedural process. This is the power of procedural modeling, shading, I should say, not modeling. And what you can do is plug many things into these. And again, there's no limit to how many nodes you can plug into these, but I'll keep it simple in this for this example. And what I'm going to do is add a new node and we'll plug that into the roughness slot. And like anything in Blender, when you add something like you do with the, in the viewport here, you can click Shift A and that will bring up the add menu. And of course, it's also here in the viewport. So I'm going to add a texture. This is not an image texture. This is actually procedural textures. Though you have the option to add an image texture there, but we won't be using that. All of the other ones are procedural textures. So they're mathematically calculated on the fly as you create them and as you change the values. I'm going to choose a noise texture and I'm going to click that there and just drop it next to our principled BSDF. So now we have a noise texture and a principled BSDF, and that plugs into the output. The output's really important. If you don't have that plugged into or anything plugged into it, you won't see anything on your model in your viewport. You may get a black render and you're wondering what's happened. Maybe you've disconnected the output and input there. So select your object, go to shading and have a look if there's any disconnections going on. The other ones we won't cover in this video. It's a little bit more advanced. So that's pretty much it there. Going back to our noise texture. Now nothing's happened to this when we added this because this is just free floating. It's not connected to anything at the moment. And you have two outputs. You have a factor, FAC, and color. And if you click on these dots, you can then drag and you get this line which gets created. And you can now just hover over another dot and it will connect. And if I release that, it will stay connected to that input. So we have an output from here going into an input on this one. And likewise, if you click one of these, you can disconnect it as well. Okay, so again, click on the factor, drag, and release when you've plugged it in. And you can see immediately that's made a change in our viewport, and our object now looks different. It now has this variation in the roughness, and that's all coming from this on the fly mathematically calculated noise texture. So let's adjust some of these values here, and these really are, you know, your playground for whichever value you want to use here. And you can see there, as I change the scale on the noise texture, the viewport is updating, of course, because we're affecting the material on this object. So a higher value makes this a much finer, noise texture. If I bring that down to something a bit more reasonable, perhaps 8.8, the detail slider does exactly that. If I just zoom in a bit there, if I increase that, you can't really see it that clearly actually. You will get more detail in the noise texture. And this will become more apparent when I increase the roughness. Let me just open this up a little bit so you can see. If I increase the roughness, you can now see here, you get a much more mottled, detailed, grainy look to the roughness now. And we also have distortion. If I click and drag this, if I just zoom out, you can see there it's becoming quite distorted, almost like ocean currents you'd see on the Weather Channel or something. So I'll leave that as 0. It's worth noting that some of these values, they kind of top out once you slide them. So that goes as low as 0. If I put it all the way to 15, that's where it stops. You can actually click on some of these and increase the value beyond its limit. It may not always work, but it can do in some places. So it's always worth a try, just changing that to maybe 30 and seeing what happens. It may not work, but worth a try, right? So let's get back to a material. Let's drop down the scale to default 5. Got the microphone in the way, so I can't really see my keyboard. And bring the roughness down just a touch. And the details on 15. And you can see there, now we've got a much more interesting material in our scene, which is very nice. So what you've done here is created a really simple material, changed its color, and we've added a procedural material into the roughness slot. And that is output into the material output. And that's it. Congratulations, you've made a material. And there are, as I said, you can get really complex with this. And I'll show you a quick comparison between this sphere and this asteroid. So if I click the asteroid, and now this is the material for the asteroid, okay? And I mean, yeah, it's not simple, but it's not overly complex once you get to understand, you know, what these groups of nodes are doing. And you can see there, when I click on the sphere, we've got this noise texture into the roughness. If I click back onto the asteroid, we have a noise texture. Again, I've just used that there. And we have a color ramp, and both of those are plugged into the roughness. So you can see the principle is exactly the same, but the outlook, or the output, I should say, and the look and style of that material is very different between the two. And that's not just because I've used these two, but it's because I've also used a noise texture for the color of the asteroid. And I've also used this group of nodes, which I've put into a box there as a frame, into the emission slot of the principal BSDF. And I've also got some normal maps here going into the normal, so just not normal maps. I've got some procedural nodes plugged into the normal map as well. And I've also got a displacement, which is plugged over here into the output. The point being, you can get very complex networks of nodes to build up something like this, and even more complex than this. But you can see there we've got a lot of detail and variety in our shader just through this. And what's really good about this is you can go in after the fact and repurpose this node for something completely different. So if you didn't want it to be this khaki green gray, you simply go to this color ramp node, which is again procedural. And just like in Photoshop and other software, you have this gradient component. Okay, so you have these markers, and if I move these markers as you would do in Photoshop, that now affects the color on our object. And of course, you can go in and change these colors to whatever you like. And I'm just going to butcher this like this. It looks terrible. And if I do that, bring it back in a little bit more, perhaps. There you go. Now we've got some sickly green stuff on our asteroid, which is quite nice actually. So yeah, that kind of demonstrates the power of procedural nodes, the flexibility and the power they enable you to create anything you can imagine and stuff that you never thought you could even imagine. And I encourage you to look at some YouTube videos by other creators such as Ducky3D. He's really good at creating these kind of procedural materials. I'm not an expert by any means, but you know, yes, I did create this, but it's not really that complicated once you break it down into chunks. Like anything, break it down into smaller parts and you think through the logic, it's actually not that difficult. Just take it one step at a time, work on one component of the material at a time, and get that to a place where you're happy with it, and then move on to the next part. Okay, now that we've gone through how to create procedural materials, simple ones at least, let's talk about appending or adding or reusing a material you've previously created or found on perhaps you've downloaded a Blender file from the internet somewhere, and you want to reuse the material in a new project. How do we do that? Blender makes that really easy. So for demonstration purposes, I've got a new file here, and how to load. I've got no materials, by the way, on this one. This is a new scene. So if I click on the material tab here, you can see there's nothing there. It's empty. And I could just create one. So let's do that and call that number 1. Okay. So let's say I want to use the asteroid material that you saw earlier, and I want to load it into this file. So what I can do is go head over to File, Append, navigate to your Blender file for that, in my case, asteroid, and I'm going to double click this one. And once you double click a Blender file, it will then open that Blender file and expose all of the different things within that file: materials, objects, meshes, lights, cameras, everything. So now you can just select what you want to append to your existing or current Blender file. So in this instance, I want to append a material, so I'll open that. In fact, I don't have the material there. Let's click on, well, that probably is it. Let's open that, and we can select a material that's in this Blender file. So I'll select this one, and I'll click this button here, which says append. Now nothing happens, of course, in the viewport. Let me just switch that to rendered mode. And as you can see, there's nothing on there. It's just this number 1 material, which is nothing. However, if I have this little drop down here, now has another material in it, one we just loaded or added to the file. So if I select this one, we've now changed this cube's material from number 1 to material, which I will call number 2. So there you go. That's how you append a material from another Blender file into your current project. So what if you don't want to create procedural materials, or don't have time to make them, or you simply don't want to? Those are all options, of course. Firstly, I'll start by saying, don't be put off by working with procedural materials. It's good to know, and it will really unlock a lot of creativity and possibilities for you. So go into the shader editor, play around with the nodes, and see what happens. That tends to be how I learn. But I also just watch other people's videos and adapt what I see there, perhaps if it works for me. If not, I'll try to kind of ad hoc and budget together. That's always an option, of course. See how you go. You have 2 options really. If you're on a tight budget, or not tight budget, but on a tight time scale, like you haven't got time to sort of mess around. So you can either revert back to using image-based textures, materials, as we saw earlier with ambient CG, or you can buy them. You can buy procedural materials online, of course, and you can also find free ones as well. They're not all paid products, of course. So in Polyhaven, as an example, if you were to use images, you would use a website such as Ambient CG or Polyhaven. And I mentioned Polyhaven in this example because with their materials, they're also providing them. Not only are they providing the image files for you to download and use, but they've also created the materials setup, the node setup with those images being used in a blend file. And then you also have that in the download in the zip file. So as an example, here's one I just downloaded and I put it in the wrong folder, of course. And it's called Pavement 02. That's from Polyhaven. If I double click that, you can see inside the file, we have a blend file, the zip file, I should say. We've got a blend file and we also have the texture maps for this material. So I think that's really nice of them to provide you with a blend file. And why is that good? Well, because as we saw earlier, if you open your current project in Blender, all you need to do is then go to File, Append, navigate to your downloaded Blender file, and append the material into your Blender file. That's it. And all of the nodes will be set up for you. Just make sure you have the images extracted, of course, and the path to those images is correct in the nodes, and it works. So that's one way to do it. Another option you have is to either find free procedural materials online, which could be hit and miss, or you can go to a website such as Blender Market, where they'll probably have free versions, not free versions, but free materials there for Blender. But they will definitely have paid products as well. So straight off the bat here, we've got this one by Ducky 3D. His stuff's quite cool, but really cool actually. If you click on that, this is effectively a pack of 290 actually procedural materials, and you buy that, you install it, whatever, into Blender, use it in Blender by appending them or opening the Blender files, and you can use them anywhere, commercially or for your own projects, and you will have a ton of different materials instantly at your fingertips. So that's one way, image based, or you can buy them or find them for free. Anyway, have fun, guys. Enjoy it. Experiment. That's the best way to learn. And don't be afraid if you fail. Failure is a great teacher. I'll do that all the time. And yeah, keep learning and having fun. I'll see you soon. Bye for now.